the 28E itself has a defined list of things that the Watershed Authority may do. Those come directly from the enabling legislation, 466B. The Watershed Authority may do these things. It doesn't say they have to, but they may do these things. And when I read those, they fall in the framework of measuring, analyzing, reporting, and education, those things. There is a parallel discussion and a parallel public record to what's in the 28E. And that parallel public record has to do with the Raccoon River Watershed Master Plan. And in that parallel public record, Linda Kinman has said at the Central Iowa Regional Drinking Water Commission that the purpose of this organization is to implement the Raccoon River Watershed Master Plan. Pat Bodie said at the June 21st meeting here that one of the purposes was to implement the Raccoon River Watershed Master Plan. In the frequently asked questions talking point document that was published with this contract, one of the statements in there is that the state code says that this organization can implement the Raccoon River Watershed Master Plan. It doesn't say that. The state code doesn't say that, but that's in here. So there's a parallel public record that says the purpose of this group is to implement the Raccoon River Watershed Master Plan. If that is the purpose, I think it should be in the document, in the 28E. And then we can debate whether or not that's valid and whether that's viable. If that is not the intent, and everybody says, no, no, that's not the intent, there's no authority, there's no intent, whatever, I come back to my recommendation, which is that in the 28E agreement, where it says the authority will do these things, right now it says, including but not limited to these things. I would change those terms to say limited to, which says this is what the Watershed Authority will do. Let's assume you want a Watershed Authority, and you have a good reason for it, and it helps the discussion, as you said, Tom. We need to have something to facilitate discussion, then limit its capability. Because when you say including but not limited to, that gives expansive capability in the future, whether it's 5 years, 10, 20, or 50 years from now, to do other things. Okay? So I would limit it to these things. Doesn't say that it can't do other things in the future. What it says is that in order to do other things in the future, it must come back to the elected officials to ask permission to do those other things. Okay? That's one point. The next point is, and I thought, Mark, you made a good point of this, is upon termination, what is left? What tendrils still reach into my county? And I would put a clause in there that says, upon termination, nothing reaches into my county. You no longer affect us, period. If we back out, and we're backing out because we don't like things, then nothing reaches into my county. I would add section 4.3.3. This gets technical, but it says basically that the bylaws and changes to the bylaws don't take effect until approved by all cooperators. Right now, I know it has to go to the cooperators for approval, but that could take some time. I wouldn't want a bylaw to change and say, well, we're going to implement it pending approval from the cooperators, which means it could be done and so forth. So I would say it has to be approved. And then in 7.1, under financial obligations, and this is important because I'll come back to the Raccoon River Watershed Master Plan. In the master plan, the recommendation is that 50% of the funding come from the entities that are in the political entities in the watershed. That's the counties, the cities, that you're going to fund 50% of the cost, and the other 50% comes from grants. So, and the basis for that is you need a sustainable, steady flow of money to keep this thing going. You can't count on grants because they come sporadically and so forth. So in my change in the terms, and I made a suggestion originally that said that the change in financial obligations from not intended to be, which is soft, to shall not be created. It was changed from not intended to be to is not created. And I still recommend shall not be created, and here's the reason. Not intended to be is a soft, it could happen, but we don't want it. No financial obligation is created is a time-specific. This document, this 2080, as it's written, does not create a financial obligation. Doesn't say anything about the future. And my terminology, shall not be created, speaks to the future. And it says that this 2080 and this watershed authority does not have the ability in the future to come back to you and ask for money. They can ask, you can say yes or no, but they can't come back and say, well, in order to participate, you have to, or anything like that. So, again, it puts control back into the hands of the elected officials. Okay? So specific items. I'm a little concerned about the parallel storyline of implementing the watershed plan. There's also a parallel storyline that changed some of the terminology in the enabling legislation. The enabling legislation said that if this watershed authority is created, it may, I'll paraphrase it, it may manage monies that are available for watershed quality that are made available to the authority. And the parallel story in the frequently asked questions talking points that's been published by Pat and Linda Kinman says they may allocate monies that are available for water quality, which is a much broader statement. It doesn't say made available to authority. It says basically any money that's made available. So state or federal money that's available in this parallel discussion could be, you could reach out and grab it and say, gee, we would like that in there. And these are references to specific documents that we've received over the course of this thing. So if I summarize the 2080 terms and conditions issues, the limited to, those things that are in the front, not including but not limited to, which is expansive. So limited to, what happens upon termination in terms of authority to you, and the financial obligation shall not be created are key factors. I understand the restriction on acquisition of land, and I know why you want to be able to accept requests and donations and so forth, and you know, a willing transfer of assets. I understand that, but once you accept that, somebody's got to manage it, pay for it, maintain it, blah, 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 blah. So you've got those costs associated. And last but not least, the 2080, as it's written, cannot be filed with the state because it doesn't meet the code, because there is no clause. There was in the Squaw Creek agreement, by the way, that was theoretically the basis, but the termination clause was so changed from the Squaw Creek termination clause that it no longer has the terminology of disposition of assets upon termination. So the 2080, as it's written, must be modified to meet that, so the board can't sign it as it exists because it doesn't meet the code. So that's a secondary problem. Okay. I can show you in the Squaw Creek where it says it, in this code where it says.
I'm thinking out loud now, if you'll forgive that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do. It doesn't have anything about disposition of assets this time. It has no assets at this time.
No, but it does have the ability to acquire assets, and it has the ability to have assets, and once...
So I'm not sure if it would need it at this point.
It needs it in the 2080 language in the Iowa
It has
code.
no assets.
Yeah.
I don't know if that can be addressed in the bylaws or
It
not.
says the 2080 language says that you have to have disposition, and it was a very simple, in the Squaw Creek agreement, it was very simple. It was the first paragraph, the opening paragraph in the termination clause, and you have that termination clause in the Squaw Creek agreement that says any monies, you know, and there's always going to be something. Even a grant that's been given to the group is an asset. You got, you know, a computer, whatever. They're assets, and it's a simple clause. It should be in there. Let me see if I can. They say, upon termination, all property and money then owned by the authority shall be distributed equally among its members. okay? And it's a simple little clause. That clause fell out when the termination clause was rewritten in the 2080. So it was there, it's no longer there. I didn't even realize that John found that.
If I may, in the Iowa Code in 28E5, which is specifications, in subparagraph 5, which is just one statement, it says the permissible method or methods to be employed in accomplishing the partial or complete termination of the agreement and for the disposing of property upon such partial or complete termination. That's the requirement from the state code.
That's in the 2080, not the bylaws. So,
That is the statement from the Iowa Code.
and I found that out this morning because John said, do you know, this, we were going through this, he said, do you know that that's not, like, no, I didn't know that, but it's not there. I couldn't find it. So the intent of the Watershed Authority and what is planned to be there, a seat at the table to discuss is one thing, and that's allocated in that front page of here are the things we can do. But some of the other things that have been suggested in this parallel discussion on the watershed management plan and so forth, and we can debate that 200-page document because it talks about nitrate and pathogen reduction. And from nitrates, I look at their list, and 47% of the nitrates in the river are from minerals in the soil and from the atmosphere. There's another 16% from lagoon fixation. 23% is from agriculture, fertilization, and I know if I was farming, I'd want to make sure that 100% of the inputs go to my outputs. I'm not interested in washing them off down the creek. So I know that any farmer that is interested in a profit is going to do everything they possibly can to take full advantage of whatever inputs they use on their property. And
You don't seriously believe that?
believe what?
That a farmer is going to do everything they can to manage their inputs and they're not going to have a leaky system?
Cost effectively, yeah. Within cost. Within cost. You think that there's people that are going to waste resource intentionally? I don't.
Go ahead, Ben.
I'd like to speak just briefly to the history of this and where we are at this point in time, and perhaps address some of Mr. Rudolph's points related directly to the 2080 agreement itself. Just as quick background, as you'll all recall, we had a 2080 agreement. There were concerns expressed about it. One of the main concerns was the tone of the agreement, that it did not match the tone of the other 2080 agreements that were out there being considered. So we took, yes, the Squaw Creek Agreement and used it as the foundation for our subsequent review of the agreements. These agreements have been reviewed by legal counsel in the different counties and also by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship's Attorney General representative for legal review. And most importantly, perhaps, Supervisor Bach was accompanied by 3 other supervisors that met at great length over at least 3 different sessions to review all of the different public comments that had been made about the potential agreement, and with the exception of the now new reference to the Raccoon River Watershed Management Plan, the comments that Mr. Rudolph is making here today, he did make in terms of the written comments, and those were reviewed by the supervisors and put into play as they assessed each one in turn and made their decisions accordingly. And where we are with this process right now is out of the 6 watershed management authorities that were allowed to be formed through the grant, there has been another one formed without a grant. But of those that were allowed to be formed with the grant, 5 have been formed. This one is the only one that has not come to fruition as yet. We have tried to work very hard to get the language as correctly as one can possibly do with any kind of document. It is always easier to be opposed to something new to be in favor. And I think that's part of our challenge here. We're all living a little bit in fear of these potential side effects that might take place. But I believe very strongly that when you read through this, it's very clear. This is about cooperating. and about bringing the counties, the cities, and the soil and water conservation districts together for opportunities to find ways that we can do an ever-increasingly better job within our counties and communities and soil and water conservation districts to improve our impact on flooding and on water quality. It is all voluntary. There is no eminent domain. The authorities of the counties, the soil and water conservation districts, and the cities are expressly not undermined, both by the state code upon which this is based, and then reiterated again through the 28E agreement. There are no assets to this watershed authority at this time. With all the legal counsel that we have had looking at this, I would anticipate that it would be perfectly legal to file it as it is. Perhaps, but I am not an attorney, so I can't particularly address that item. But when we look at the other aspects of things that Mr. Rudolph is concerned about, for example, the language related to including but not limited to, the supervisors discussed that at length and felt very strongly that if in the future the legislature puts in place additional opportunities, that they did not want to deny the people around the table to be able to look at those other opportunities. So that's why they did not do the limited piece. Now, as far as the Raccoon River Watershed Management Plan is engaged here, it is clearly an option for the Watershed Management Authority to look at the Raccoon River Watershed Management Plan as an opportunity, and potentially implementing aspects of it may be an opportunity. But if you read the plan, you will recognize, and Tom can address this much better than anyone else in the room because he was, of course, instrumental in writing the plan, but it's a high-level plan. The idea here was for sub-watersheds to get in play and look at things much more closely. And so what we're trying to do here is simply provide an opportunity for various players to cooperate together. And one of the key reasons why this needs to be done somewhat formally through a 28E agreement versus more casually, one thing it puts into play is a great deal of accountability. These will be public meetings, and the public will be able to be at those meetings, and there will be good opportunity for input. So that's one piece. The other reason is, without the 28E agreement, without the watershed management group forming, it will be more challenging for those who do make grants to recognize the level of cooperation that is in the watershed. Some of the grants that are coming up, we have missed the Phase 2 planning grants, but a couple of significant pieces, and I believe Tom probably has a much expanded list from what I have. But the Iowa Department of Land, Agriculture and Land Stewardship is looking at a development and planning assistance grant, $15,000 for different watershed planning efforts. And perhaps one of the things that's up and of interest is in April of 2013, watershed improvement grants of $1.8 million. I'm not saying it'll be $1.8 million each, a total of $1.8 million will be offered through the state, available to groups having an approved watershed plan. Also, the state revolving fund is right now looking at putting into play as much as $15 million in sponsored projects. I am, too, an extreme fiscal conservative. I have no personal debt for a reason, and I like to keep my taxes low, just like everybody else. But I also believe that when we look at flooding and some of the other water quality issues that we have, we are looking at additional costs that can be mitigated through stitch and time saves nine kind of approaches. And that's what would be in play here, quite hopefully. That would be the intent. Not to cause additional issues, and of course, anything we do, we've got to be careful about it. I think the analogy to medication is well taken. I'm not on any medicines either. But we have to take each thing in turn and weigh it. And what this does is it allows us that opportunity to do that, and to do that in a way that might be able to drive some resources when we do find a voluntary opportunity that we want to take and want to put into play. Just one last quick story, and then I think Tom might have some funding sources and some other comments that he wanted to make. And that is that Soap Creek did this work roughly 30 years ago. There was no authorizing language in state code. They just did it through 28E agreement and cooperatively identified 150 projects they wanted to put in place. And over time, by virtue of having this collaborative entity, my numbers could be off, don't quote me on this, but roughly 120, 130 of these projects have been put into play, a goodly number. That's the kind of thing we're talking about, being able to put into place activities that everybody around the table agrees make good sense.
Very good. Thank you, Lynn. Tom?
Yeah, I would address grants. That grants are a good way of making government efficient. Okay, they put out money, and instead of spending it themselves, they say, are there private businesses or other institutions that have better ideas and better methodology of doing it than us? And that's how grants work. It's not the Sunday morning, there's $6 billion worth of grants given away by the federal government. All you have to do is put your name on a paper and send it in and you get a grant. We work in the grant world day in and day out. Marty knows it. Marty has worked on them. They are a very efficient way of doing it. We have competed on the national level for grants. We've had some of the highest ranked grants in the nation through Iowa State Extension Service, and it's a very efficient way of putting out money. Grants are going to continue to come because the government realizes that they cannot put all the staff in place to do all the work that needs to be done with the money that they have, and a more efficient way is putting it out through grants. Whether they're county grants, state grants, federal grants. I mean, think of your block grants. However, grants are not a bad thing. They are a good thing. Now, are there bad grants? Absolutely. Are there horrible grants? Certainly. But are there good grants? There are a lot of good grants. There's a lot of funding service. We've worked at the Walton Foundation, Walmart. We've worked at the Howard Buffett Foundation. You know them. We've worked with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Wells Fargo gives money to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to give out grants. You probably recently heard of the settlement in the Gulf where BP Amoco gave National Fish and Wildlife $200 billion, I mean some huge number, to distribute for conservation projects. That money, as you said, Mark, is going to go somewhere. We have a chance of having a competitive organization bringing in voluntary money to do good work.
I guess to add to that, Tom, I look at the grants. In the past, we've worked with the Word grant with Maple River. I mean, we got about $104,000 worth of funding there. It was a good thing. It went to a good cause. And the thing of it is, with these grants down the road, they're going to get more competitive. And at a local level, we have to be involved to get these grants.
Well, and more the bias is in favor of having a collaborative in place like this. More and more of these grants are based on watershed, not on, well, they might be awarded to an individual city or county. They're being based on, are they taking a watershed look? Are they looking at the impacts up and downstream of this particular activity? So that's kind of what's in play here.
Very well. Anybody else? Hubert?
Yeah, I'd like to address a couple of comments along the way. Tom made the comment that we have to have this 2080 agreement to force people to get along together.
Well, now, if I said that, I retract
You used that. You
Then
used
I
that.
retract it.
Okay, well, anyway. Secondly, Neil, you mentioned that to work together. Well, I noticed that you and Greene County, when you have trouble or have need for working on water and drainage districts and that kind of stuff, you're working together, you're talking back and forth and that kind of stuff. There's occasions when you're working with Crawford County, you're working back and forth. Why can't we continue to do this? We don't need another 20-year agreement to do this kind of stuff. I think that this is also sort of like, and a lot of you in here aren't aware of, or aren't old enough to know before Regional 12 Council of Governments started out. And that was just supposed to be to talk about things and look at how it has expanded and expanded and expanded. And I think this is the same problem here. Mark, you also made the comment, you talked to Roger Wolf, and I thank you for doing it because that was my suggestion. And he told you about the different projects that were done on a voluntary basis. We didn't need this 2080 agreement to get it done. There was some producers that were in violation. There was changes made and that kind of stuff. And so I just think that this is another entity that it's just gonna be, isn't needed to accomplish what we want to accomplish. Another thing, Mark, you said, well, you would like to get rid of the grants. Well, and I know that if Chrysler made a car and it was selling, they'd keep on making the car. But if Chrysler made a car and nobody came and bought it, guess what? It would go away. And if everybody's going to keep on with this mentality that we've got to get the grants because somebody else will get them, aren't we kind of greedy, number one? And number two, how are we ever going to get it stopped if we all keep wishing for more handout from Washington? And why should we send money to Washington so they can send it back to us? Or send the money to Des Moines so they can send it back to us? And another thing that with some of these rules and regulations, I talked to a guy in Dallas County who had a EQIP grant money and given to him. He's got a dam and I have not seen the pond, I'm gonna say, and I have not seen it, but he said, I got 8 foot of sidewalls on top of the water level that I don't know, I never will get that much water in there. And I've had some personal experience with, and Tom, you're gonna have to help me out a little bit with the acronym that I need to use for, I do no-tilling and getting some payments, which is that program.
It's EQIP, which is not a grant, it's a cost share program.
Well, no, this would be for in farming.
CRP would not make. Yeah, EQIP is an incentive payment that can be used for no-till.
Well, there's another one, but anyway, I applied for that because I do no-till and that kind of stuff, and well, I had to have some conservation practice or wildlife practice put together. So okay, I did some of that. Submitted it. It was rejected. Didn't have enough wildlife habitat and that kind of. I made another addition. It was submitted. I rejected it. And that's the way it goes. We get things that we got to continually have extra costs that we don't need, and so I've quit trying to apply for them simply because it just gets too costly and too costly to maintain, and you can do it cheaper yourself. And then the other thing is, I think this is going to be a chance for activists to get involved and get more involved, and that's where we're going to be really costing us money. And so I would hope that you would reject this 2080 agreement, working with Des Moines, working with the other counties, and that kind of stuff. I have no problems with that, but let's forget about the 2080 agreement.
Very good. There's activists in this whole room.
I understand.
We're glad that you're active, so.
And I'm one of them. I understand that. But
activists isn't all bad. So.
It isn't all bad, but I want to be able to control which activists.
Oh, of course you do. Okay, very good. John, I'm going to throw it out. You're probably, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know Mondays aren't the best, but you've been sitting quite quietly, and I know you've got some input at least on the 2080 at the very least. So.
Well, I have no additional comments. Some of the board members and I've been conversing, and I've been giving you the best advice that I can, and I have no additional comments appropriate for this public hearing.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I would ask Tom just one real quick question. Back to one of my concerns, the science of watershed and flood mitigation. It's pretty important to me that we don't back water upstream. Sorry, Des Moines, but that's your problem. I don't want to have the problem up here. In your plan, in your 200-page plan, I really haven't delved into it much. Can you address any of the recommendations made in that plan that could possibly, even remotely, negatively affect land and property owners here in Carroll County?